The heat in the town hall that August evening was the kind that pressed against your skin like a held breath, like the air itself had decided to wait. 43 people sat in folding chairs beneath a ceiling fan that turned without conviction, and at the front of the room stood a woman named Mara Voss, with her hands folded over a cardboard box and a quiet in her eyes that made certain people look away. She was 8 months along. She wore work boots that had been resoled twice and a cotton dress that had seen better summers. The room smelled of sawdust and nerves. On the long table behind her sat 7 sealed glass jars, each one catching the last orange light through the west windows like small lanterns. The man from Ridgemont Capital sat in the front row in a linen shirt that cost more than most of the farmers in that room made in a month, and he was smiling the way people smile when they believe a thing is already settled. He had been smiling like that for 6 weeks. He would not be smiling by the time Mara Voss opened her mouth. The real verdict, it should be said plainly, had not been passed in this room. It had been passed in a greenhouse in late February, in the dark, by something that did not speak but only grew, and anyone who had been paying the right kind of attention would have seen it coming from that moment forward. But most people had not been paying that kind of attention. Most people had been laughing. She had arrived in this valley in the 3rd week of October the year before, 11 months before this evening, and 7 weeks before she knew she was pregnant, though she would later say the land seemed to know before she did. She came in a 12-year-old pickup truck packed with a single mattress, a box of tools she had inherited from her mother, and $41,000 in a savings account that represented every dollar she had ever put aside from 6 years of greenhouse work in the nursery trade in the flatlands east of here. She had no family left to speak of. Her mother had died in the spring, her grandfather had died in September, and the lawyer's letter had arrived in October, addressed to her in her grandfather's shaky hand, as if he had written the envelope himself long ago and told someone to send it when the time came, which was exactly what he had done. The letter said that her grandfather, Emil Voss, had left her the parcel at the end of Sutter Road, 11 acres and a sealed workshop, and a legacy greenhouse frame in a state of considerable disrepair, assessed by the county at $9,000, subject to 18 months of delinquent property tax, totaling $3,100. The letter also said that attached to the deed were the cultivation records her grandfather had kept for 40 years, and that these records were considered part of the property and could not be separated from it. Mara had read the letter 3 times at her kitchen table in her rented room, and then she had paid the back taxes and quit her job and driven west. The valley was the kind of beautiful that does not immediately announce itself. It announced itself in September, people said, when the light went amber and the hills turned the color of old honey. In October, it was merely brown and enormous and ringed with ridges that looked like the spines of sleeping animals. The Sutter Road parcel was at the far end of the valley where the road turned to gravel, and the neighbors were thin on the ground. The workshop was a board and batten structure the size of a generous barn, sealed with 2 padlocks and a crossbeam, and it sat against a hillside with its back half dug into the slope so that its temperature stayed even year-round. The greenhouse frame was 2,200 square feet of steel pipe and broken glass. The 11 acres included 8 acres of heavy clay soil that had not been worked in at least a decade, and a south-facing slope of perhaps 3 acres that was rocky and thin and covered in the dried stalks of something she did not immediately recognize. The county assessor had appraised the property at $9,000. The assessor's assistant had written in the margin of the report, in pencil that had not quite been erased, the words, "Not worth the drive out." The woman at the county office who handed Mara the copy had not quite managed to hide her expression when Mara paid the taxes with a personal check and asked which parcel the Voss cultivation records were filed under. That expression was one Mara would come to know well over the following months. It was the expression of a person filing away a small harmless story to tell later. She spent the first 2 weeks clearing the greenhouse frame and taking inventory of what her grandfather had left sealed in the workshop. She did this alone, with a headlamp and a crowbar and careful hands, and what she found occupied her thoughts for a long time. The workshop contained stacked floor-to-ceiling on a system of cedar shelving her grandfather had built himself, 412 clay seed crocks sealed with wax, each one labeled in his handwriting with a name, a year, and a 2-letter code she did not yet understand. It contained 40 years of cultivation journals in a row of black composition books. It contained hand-drawn maps of the 11 acres marked with what appeared to be water readings and soil temperature notations. And it contained, in a separate cedar box with a hinged lid lined in old chamois, a single sealed letter addressed to her by name with the instruction written on the outside, "Read this last." She did not read it last. She read it third, after the cultivation journals going back to 1981 and after the soil maps. She was not proud of this, but she also knew that her grandfather, who had understood patience better than most, would have understood her impatience with the chamois box. The letter said, among other things, "The seeds are nothing by themselves. The hillside is everything. The clay is your enemy until you make it your partner. You will find the way I found it, which is the slow way, which is the only way. Do not sell the seeds to any man who comes to you in a hurry. They will come in a hurry. Do not let them make you hurry too. What goes into the ground slowly comes out of it surely. What goes in under pressure comes out crooked." He had also written, "I know you are scared. That is right. The scared ones pay attention." She was scared. The arithmetic was stark. She had $36,900 left after the taxes and the drive, and a greenhouse frame that needed $4,000 in glass, and materials to be functional, and a heating system in the workshop that cost $600 a year in propane to run through the winter, and 11 acres of dead-looking land, and a collection of seeds so old that half of them might not germinate, and no income, and by late November, when she drove to the clinic in town because she had been tired in a specific and unfamiliar way for 6 weeks, no longer just herself to feed. The nurse at the clinic was kind, and the doctor was matter-of-fact, and Mara drove home on Sutter Road in the dark with the heater running and a number in her head. $1,200 a month was the minimum she needed to survive, to stay in the workshop building through the winter, to keep the seed storage heated, to keep the propane running, to eat. She had 30 months of runway if she spent nothing else. She had perhaps 20 before the margin became too thin. The seeds had to work. They had to work in the next growing season, or the one after, at the outside, or the arithmetic would close on her like a hand. She did not tell anyone in town about the seeds, or the cultivation journals, or the 40 years of records. She bought glass and glazing compound at the hardware store in town and paid in cash and spoke little. She ate at the diner twice and heard herself described by a man in a booth across the room who did not know she could hear him as that Voss girl who bought old Emil's mess. She was not a girl. She was 31 years old. She let it sit where it fell. The hardware store owner's name was Draper. The man from Ridgemont Capital's name was Gerald Fenn, and he appeared for the first time in Mara's driveway on a Thursday in late November, driving a late-model truck with the Ridgemont Capital logo on the door in a font that was meant to suggest both authority and friendliness. He was perhaps 50, silver-haired, with the practiced warmth of a man who had converted warmth into a professional tool long ago. He told her that Ridgemont had been acquiring parcels in the valley to consolidate operations, and that her property, while admittedly not much to look at, sat on a road corridor they needed for access, and that they would pay her $65,000 for the parcel, including all contents, which he framed as a generous offer on land assessed at $9. Mara said, "Thank you, no." Fenn said he understood and left a card and said the offer would stand for 30 days. She put the card in the kindling box. It was the last time he would be warm about it without effort. The glazing of the greenhouse took 3 weeks of cold-fingered work. She worked from sunrise to the light, failing, and then worked an hour more by flood lamp. She was 4 months pregnant by the time the last pane was seated, and she stood inside the frame for the first time with the glass hole around her and felt the heat begin to collect even in November. And she thought, there it is. That is the first thing. The second thing was the germination test. She took 12 crocks at random from the shelving, opened them at the wax seal, counted out 20 seeds from each, laid them on damp cloth in the warmth of the workshop, and waited. She had learned germination testing from her mother, who had learned it from Emile, and she knew the window. After 8 days, she counted the sprouts. Of 240 seeds, 197 germinated, 82%. For seeds, some of which were labeled in years as far back as 1988, this was not merely good. This was extraordinary. This was the product of her grandfather's storage method, the sealed crocks, the wax, the cedar shelves, the even temperature of the hillside banked building that never got below 42 degrees Fahrenheit and never went above 68, 40 years of careful cold keeping, 82% of a dead man's life's work, still alive, still reaching for the light. She sat down on a stool in the workshop and did not cry, but sat for a long time with her hands in her lap and the smell of damp seed cloth around her, and then she stood up and began reading the cultivation journals in earnest. What her grandfather had spent 40 years developing, she understood within 2 weeks of close reading, was a collection of regionally adapted heirloom vegetable and herb varieties, each one selected over successive seasons for performance in this valley's specific conditions: the heavy clay soil, the short frost window, the alkaline water, the particular disease pressures. He had not been selling them, he had been perfecting them. The 2-letter codes on the crocks corresponded to cross-reference entries in the cultivation journals that noted the specific qualities selected for each variety over time: drought tolerance, flavor intensity, days to maturity, root depth. He had done this alone in this workshop for 40 years, and he had told no one because, as he wrote in the journal entry dated January of 2019, there is no profit in telling people about what you are doing until the thing is done and the season has proved it. Bank it like a coal kept low. Let the ash cover it and keep it warm and patient until the time is right. She read that sentence 3 times. Then she wrote it at the top of the first blank page in a new composition book and carried it forward. There was an old man on Sutter Road whose name was Benedek Farkas, and he was 81 years old, Hungarian by birth, a retired smallholder whose English was precise and accented and given to a certain compressed aphoristic quality that made his sentences feel like they had been worn smooth by use. He had known Emile Voss. He appeared at Mara's door on a Saturday in December with a jar of pickled peppers and no explanation, and when she opened the door, he looked at her for a moment and said, "You have the same hands." She let him in. He sat at her kitchen table and looked at the cultivation journals stacked there and said, "Ah, so." He did not ask her to explain them. She did not. They drank coffee, and he told her that her grandfather had once said to him that the land in this valley was a closed book, and all a farmer could do was listen at the spine of it and hear what pages were turning. He said it in Hungarian first, and then translated it himself and said he meant, "The land already knows what it wants to grow. You are only helping it remember." Then he looked at her stomach, and looked at the journals, and looked out the window at the greenhouse frame gleaming in the cold light, and said, "You're going to have a busy spring." She said, "I know." He said, "Good. That is the right answer." Benedict came back every week after that. Sometimes he stayed an hour, sometimes half a day, and he never came empty-handed, and he never asked questions that were not useful. He looked at her soil maps and told her which of the 3-acre Rocky Slopes microclimates drained fastest and which held moisture. He told her that the clay field had been compacted by a decade of vehicle traffic from when Emil had leased it to a neighbor for hay, and that the best way to open it was not to till it, but to plant it with a deep-rooted cover crop through the late winter and let the roots fracture the hardpan, which was slower but lasted. He told her that the water in the valley ran 7 feet below the clay, and that her grandfather had known this and had laid a shallow perforated pipe system along the lower edge of the hillside slope that collected the subsurface drainage and could be redirected with a simple valve he had installed under the workshop floor, a valve she had seen but not understood. He showed her where it was. He showed her how it opened. He told her that her grandfather had called this system the memory of the hill, because the hill had been collecting water in its rock layers since before any of them were born, and the pipe let you borrow what the hill remembered. The child who appeared was named, as far as Mara could determine, Danny, and he was 9 years old. He came from the Alcott place 3/4 of a mile down Sutter Road, a family of 5 children and a father who drove a harvesting rig and a mother who was thin and tired and kind. Danny appeared at the greenhouse on a Saturday in January and watched Mara work through the glass for 20 minutes before she opened the door and asked him in. He never explained himself. He sat on the overturned bucket she gave him and watched her transplant seedlings from germination trays to 4-inch pots, and after a while he said, "The one on the end is coming up crooked." She looked, and it was. He had a rancher's eye in a 9-year-old face. She gave him a dibber and showed him how to pot up a seedling, and he was careful with it in a way she recognized. He came back the next Saturday and the one after that. By March he had named 12 of the seedling varieties after people he knew. The one that grew fastest was his sister Clara. The one that grew sideways was his father. The stubborn, slow one with the deepest roots was old Benedek, which made Benedek laugh when he heard it, a long, satisfied laugh. The winter was the time of banking the coal. She germinated seeds in 3 successive waves, selected the strongest performers, potted them up, grew them on in the greenhouse, and kept notes in her new composition books that mirrored her grandfather's in method, if not in content. She did not know yet what she had. She knew she had something. The germination rates held. The plants that emerged from the oldest crocks were not weaker than the newer ones. They were, if anything, more vigorous, as if 40 years of careful selection had concentrated something in them. The herbs especially grew with an intensity that surprised her. She rubbed a leaf of the basil variety labeled BV04 between her fingers one evening, and stood still for a moment because the smell was not merely good, it was extraordinary, layered and dark and warm, in a way she had never encountered in 6 years of nursery work. She wrote in her composition book, "What does this become?" Then below it, in smaller letters, "Be patient." She was nearly out of patience in March when she could not lift a flat of seedling trays without stopping to rest, and the lower back pain had become a constant, and the propane bill had come in $300 higher than projected, and she sat with her ledger on the workshop floor on a night when the temperature outside dropped to 28, and looked at her number and thought, 18 months. That is what I have. And she was due in 8 weeks. And she had not told anyone in town except the doctor. She took the chamois box out and read her grandfather's letter again, and sat with the line the scared ones pay attention until the weight of the cold room around her became something other than a problem, and became instead simply a condition she was equal to, because she was here, and the seeds were here, and the hillside was here, and the hill had a 40-year memory, and she had just begun. Her daughter was born in late April on a Tuesday at the county hospital, and Mara drove herself home on Thursday with the child in a borrowed car seat and Benedek's wife, a small watchful woman named Erzsébet, who had said nothing at all during the pregnancy and arrived without announcement, staying in the workshop living space and cooking soup and doing the seedling watering with absolute silent competence for the first 2 weeks. Mara did not know how to thank her. Erzsébet waved this off as though gratitude were beside the point. She left on a Sunday, and Mara looked at the greenhouse and looked at her daughter, asleep in the borrowed bassinet in the warm corner of the workshop, and looked at the calendar, and then went back to work. It was in May, 6 weeks after the birth, that she found the thing she had been working toward without knowing it. She was transplanting the 5th succession of the hillside varieties into the prepared beds on the rocky slope, following her grandfather's soil maps, placing each variety in the microclimate he had coded for it, opening the drainage valve according to Benedict's instruction. And she noted that the plants she had set out 3 weeks earlier were not merely surviving, they were accelerating. The basil was knee-high in places where basil should have been ankle-high. The dry farming tomato she had labeled VT11 had put down a taproot she could feel resisting when she checked a plant's anchor, deep and certain, pulling water from somewhere below the rock. She walked the slope in the evening light and counted what she had and wrote in her composition book, 42 varieties on the hillside, 218 plants in the greenhouse, projected first harvest at 8 weeks. Her arithmetic shifted. If the quality held what the smell of BV04 had suggested it would hold, she did not need to sell large quantity. She needed to sell right quality to the right people. She thought about what that looked like and where those people were, and then she wrote market value, restaurant trade, specialty buyers. Prove the quality first, then let the quality speak. Bank it. Keep the ash over the coal. She did not go to the farmer's market in June. She waited. Gerald Fenn came to her driveway again in June, a second visit, and this time the warmth had thinned slightly at the edges. He said Ridgemont had revised their access plan and would no longer require the full parcel, but would pay $42,000 for the greenhouse structure and the workshop building only, leaving her the land, which she would not need to farm if she chose not to. The phrasing "chosen to farm if she chose not to" was a particular kind of condescension that depended for its operation on the assumption that she might not have chosen to farm already, that the workshop was empty, that the greenhouse was ornamental. She looked at him for a moment and said, "I'm not selling any part of it." He said he understood and left. She heard through the hardware store owner Draper, who was a fair-minded man and passed things on neutrally, that Fenn had told people she was sitting on a piece of ground that would never produce anything and was burning through her savings, and that someone ought to have a kind word with her before the bank had to. The implication was that Fenn would be that kind someone. Mara heard this report and kept working. The outside validator arrived in July. His name was Renard Kessler, and he was a chef who had driven out from the city 3 hours away to visit a farm 2 valleys east, and had taken a wrong turn onto Sutter Road, and pulled over to read his map and smelled something. He said this himself later to anyone who asked, "I smelled something." He knocked on her door and asked what was growing on the slope. She brought him a basket of the first harvest, 7 varieties of tomato, 4 herbs, 2 types of dried beans still in the shell, a bundle of the BV04 basil. He stood in her driveway and tasted items from the basket for 10 minutes without speaking, and then said, "What do you want for a bushel case of those tomatoes and an ongoing weekly supply of the basil?" She named a price that was twice what the farmer's market would have fetched. He agreed without negotiating. He said, "I'll send you a contract Monday." He drove away. She stood in the driveway in the July heat and looked at the number she had written on her palm with a pen, and then at the slope covered in green, and thought, "There is the second thing. The coal is warm. Keep the ash." She kept it. She supplied Kessler through August and September, and 2 other restaurants found her through Kessler's recommendation, and by September She had 4 accounts and a waiting list, and her monthly revenue had crossed $1,400 and was climbing, and she had stopped spending down her savings. She put money in. She did not tell anyone in town. Fen came a 3rd time in August, and the warmth was gone completely now, replaced by a professional neutrality that was colder than open hostility. He said Ridgemont had acquired 6 other parcels in the valley and that her property was increasingly isolated within their access corridor, and that it would be in her interest to consider whether she wanted to be the only small operation surrounded on all sides by consolidated land. She said, "I understand your position." He looked at her, measuring something, and then he said, "You're still here alone with an infant, Miss Voss." She heard the word alone the way it was meant. She said, "Yes." Then she closed the door. What Fen did next she learned from Draper and from Benedek's wife, Erzsébet, who heard things at the church. He told the County Planning Commission that the Voss parcel appeared to be operating a commercial horticultural operation without the applicable conditional use permit. This was technically accurate. She needed a permit. She had not known she needed one because her grandfather's operation had been grandfathered under an old agricultural use designation that Fen had apparently spent time researching, because the grandfathering applied only to operations continuous from the original permit date. And there had been a gap of 11 months between Emil's death and Mara's arrival when the land was unused, which Fen argued constituted a break in continuity sufficient to void the grandfather clause. The county attorney was not unsympathetic, but said the argument had legal merit and that she would need to apply for the permit, which would take 60 to 90 days, during which time she could not sell commercially. The permit application fee was $1,200. She filed the permit application with $1,200 she had earned from Kessler. She waited. She kept growing. She supplied Kessler with a note explaining the permit situation, and Kessler said, "I'll pay you at the end of the permit window. Hold my orders." He held his orders. She waited and grew and counted her runway, and Benedek sat at her kitchen table and said, "The man is not fighting the land. He is fighting you. The land does not notice him." He said, "The land's memory is longer than a lawyer's argument." The drought arrived in the valley in the 2nd week of July of that year. The summer, the permit was granted in mid-June, and she had been selling for 4 uninterrupted weeks, and the waiting list had become a real list. The drought arrived, as her grandfather had written in the journal entry of 1988 about a previous dry year, like someone opening the door of a furnace room and stepping back. The temperature climbed to 104 degrees and stayed for 9 days, and then came back and stayed for 11 more. And the rain that should have come in July did not come, and the rain that should have come in August did not come, and the wells in the valley floor began to drop. The conventional operations in the valley, the row crop farms, the 2 large commercial vegetable growers, Ridgemont's consolidated fields with their center pivot irrigation drawing from the valley aquifer, all began to feel the drawdown. The aquifer had not recharged fully from the previous dry year. A state monitoring report in August said the aquifer was at 62% of normal. By September, it was at 51%, and the county had issued voluntary restriction notices. The hillside on Sutter Road did not notice in the way the valley floor noticed. The hillside's drainage system, the perforated pipe running along the slope's base that collected the hillside's deep rock memory and moved it to where the roots could find it, had been designed by Emil Voss for exactly this situation, designed for the valley's driest years, designed because he had known since 1988 that the aquifer could fail and that a farmer on this hillside who depended on the aquifer instead of on the hill itself was a farmer betting against the hill's patience. Mara's plants did not wilt. The basil did not bolt. The tomatoes set fruit through August and into September, when the valley floor's tomatoes were shriveling on baked vines. The dry beans filled their pods. She walked the slope in the evening and counted the plants that were growing toward her with the same calm, deep certainty they had shown since May, and she thought of her grandfather's sentence about the hill's memory, and felt something she recognized only later as gratitude, not general gratitude, but the particular kind directed at a person, at Emil Voss, who had been 40 years patient, so that she could be 8 months patient and arrive at this moment with water. She had water. The valley did not. Ridgemont's fields went to 40% yield in September. The 2 commercial vegetable growers cut their harvests by more than half. The county farmers market shrank to 8 vendors where there had been 30. Restaurants in the city began calling Kessler, asking where he was sourcing his produce because theirs had failed, and Kessler said Sutter Road, which was a name that had not previously meant anything to anyone in the city's restaurant trade, and then it meant something. The first person who came to her from the valley was not Fenn. It was Martin Graves, who had the largest row crop operation in the valley, and who had, at the auction of a neighboring parcel the previous October, said in front of 8 other farmers, in reference to Mara's purchase of the Voss parcel, that it was a shame what happened to old Emil's land, ending up with someone who thought a greenhouse was farming. He had said this without knowing she was standing 12 feet behind him. She had heard it and written it in her composition book because she had decided early to keep a record of the things said, not out of bitterness, but because she wanted to know later which words had carried weight and which had been empty. Martin Graves came to her door on a Wednesday in September with his hat in his hands. He was 60 years old, and he had the look of a man who had done the arithmetic and arrived at an answer he did not like. He said that his well was at 31 feet and dropping, and he had 200 acres of winter squash planted, and if he did not water them in the next 3 weeks, he would lose the crop and the contract it was supposed to fill, which represented $400,000 in income. He said that someone had told him she had a surface water system that was still running. He said he would pay her fairly. He said he was sorry about what he said at the auction, and that he had meant nothing personal by it, which was not quite an apology, but was, from Martin Graves, a significant expenditure of pride. She looked at him for a moment. She said, "Come inside." She put the kettle on. She got out the soil maps and showed him how her grandfather's hillside collection system worked and what it was capable of and what it was not. She told him she could share a timed flow from the lower collection pipe for 3 hours on alternate mornings, which would not save his whole crop, but would save a portion of it. She said she would charge him $50 a session, which was the cost of the wear on her valves and connections, and nothing more. He said, "That's not enough." She said, "That's the price." He paid it. He shook her hand and left. Fenn had been watching. She knew it by then, because in August he had made an offer on her water rights that referenced a flow rate she had never disclosed to anyone, a rate she had calculated only in her private composition books, and which he had rounded to the nearest 100 liters per hour in a way that suggested he had estimated from observation rather than measured from records, which meant he had been on her property without invitation or had been watching from the road with equipment. She had noted the figure in her book and kept it. She knew he would move when the drought made water the only currency that mattered in the valley. He moved on the 3rd of October. He called a town meeting at the county hall under the auspices of an emergency agricultural resource coordination committee that he had apparently established the week before with 3 signatures, 2 of them from Ridgemont-affiliated operations. He presented a proposal in which Ridgemont would purchase the Voss parcel outright for $120,000, develop the hillside water collection system into a shared resource under Ridgemont management, and distribute water allocations to valley farmers at rates to be determined by Ridgemont based on acreage enrolled in their consolidated operation, which meant that the water her grandfather had spent 40 years building a system to access would become a fee-based resource controlled by the man who had tried to buy her out 3 times and failed. And every farmer in the valley who needed water would need to be a Ridgemont tenant to get it. She let him finish. She sat in the 3rd row and let him present the proposal for 25 minutes, complete with a map that included the Voss parcel outlined in Ridgemont blue as if it were already acquired. Then she stood up. The room turned to look at her, and she walked to the front and set her cardboard box on the table beside the 7 sealed glass jars, and she turned to face 43 people who were thirsty and frightened and needed something from her. She said, "My name is Mara Voss. My grandfather, Emil Voss, spent 40 years understanding this land. He built the water collection system on the Sutter Road hillside with his own hands between 1987 and 1989. I have the permits for it, the engineering records, and the water rights filing that he registered in 1989 under his name, which transferred to me under his will as an appurtenant right to the parcel. The parcel is not for sale." She paused. She said, "The water is available to every farm in this valley that needs it. I will charge $50 a session, 3-hour time flows on a schedule we make together, and the schedule will be set by need, not by who is enrolled with any corporation." She set her hand on the cardboard box. She said, "The 7 jars on this table are the first of 412 varieties of seed my grandfather developed for this valley's specific soil and drought conditions. The germination rate is 82% on seeds stored for up to 40 years. I am offering seed packets to any farm in this valley that wants to try them next season. The price is $5 a packet, which is the cost of the envelopes and my time, and not $1 more, because the seeds belong to this valley, and my grandfather would not have wanted them sold." Gerald Fenn stood up. He said, "Miss Voss, what you're describing is an informal arrangement with no legal standing that would leave valley farmers without a reliable infrastructure partner, and Ridgemont is in a position to formalize and protect." She said, "Mr. Fenn, the flow rate you mentioned in your August water rights purchase offer was 430 liters per hour. I have never disclosed that figure to anyone. The system capacity is 431 liters per hour at peak, which is a number that appears in my private working notebooks and nowhere else. Would you like to tell these people how you know it?" The room was quiet. Fenn said nothing for a long moment. Then he said, "I believe the county assessor's office may have—" She said, "The county assessor's office has a figure of 402 liters per hour in the original 1989 filing, not 430. She opened the cardboard box and placed the original 1989 water rights filing on the table. The room looked at it and looked at Fenn. Someone in the back coughed. Fenn sat down. Martin Graves stood up from the second row. He removed his hat. He said, "I've been buying water from Miss Voss at $50 a session since September, and my squash crop is alive." He sat down. The woman next to him, who ran the valley's only certified organic operation, stood and said that she had been on the waiting list for Mara's seed varieties since August, and that Kessler had told her the basil alone was worth coming to the valley for. 3 more people stood. Nobody stood for Fenn. He gathered his folder and his map and walked to the door and paused there and looked back at the room and saw that it had turned fully and quietly, the way a room does when the last person decides, and sits down again. And he walked out. Benedek Farkas was in the back row. He had been there the whole time, which Mara had not known until she looked up after Fenn left, and he caught her eye and nodded once with the particular satisfaction of a man who had been fairly certain of an outcome and was gratified to see the world confirm his estimate. After the meeting, when the room had thinned and several people were looking at the 7 seed jars with the quiet attention of the newly interested, he came to the table and looked at the jars and looked at her and said, "Your grandfather used to say that a farmer who listens to the land finds the land listening back." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "It is listening." The rains came in the 3rd week of October, 3 weeks after the town hall meeting, as if the valley had been waiting for the question to be settled before it permitted itself to recover. They were good rains, 3 inches over 5 days, slow enough to soak rather than run, and when they were done, the hills went from the color of old straw to a green so vivid it looked implausible. The aquifer began to recharge. The county lifted its voluntary restrictions in November. Mara walked the hillside on the first dry morning after the rains with her daughter on her back in a carrier and counted the plants, which had set a final late flush of fruit in the cooler weather. She stopped at the highest point of the slope, the point where she could see the valley laid out below her in its recovered green, and she held there for a moment in the October light. The hill's drainage valve was open beneath the workshop floor, still running its slow, patient trickle from the rock below. And somewhere in the workshop, the 400 crocks that remained sealed on their cedar shelves held their 4 decades of careful selection, still warm, still between 42 and 68 degrees, still patient. The arithmetic in her composition book had changed again. It showed a number in the positive column and a waiting list of seed inquiries from 11 farms in 3 counties and 4 restaurants with standing orders and a daughter who was 5 months old and had the look of someone paying very close attention. She wrote at the bottom of the page, below the numbers, "What the land knew before I arrived, it is still knowing. I am only helping it remember." She closed the book. The valley below her was green and enormous, and the October light was exactly the color people had told her it would be in September when she arrived, amber and old as honey, arriving a month late, right on time.
Faut qu'on aille là-bas. Nous sommes le combien? Nous sommes le 7, 8, 9, 10. Il reste 3 jours si vous voulez me soutenir sur la chaîne, les amis, pour faire monter la barre qui est au-dessus de ma caméra. Il reste 3 jours si vous avez l'envie, les moyens surtout. N'hésitez pas. Ça fait toujours plaisir. Ah, c'est gentil Enzo. Merci, merci. Bah, toute aide est bonne à prendre. Après, je t'avoue que j'ai des bons piliers là. Hein. Mais tu peux rejoindre, bien évidemment, donner des conseils. Et là, on va prendre le temps. On va prendre le temps d'aller faire... prendre le plus d'avance possible pour la prochaine bannière. On va se calmer un peu parce que vous m'avez foutu la